Hello and welcome to this deep dive conversation. According to the latest Council of Europe research data, more women are being imprisoned than ever before, with England and Wales now counting the highest proportion of incarcerated women in Europe. So, is prison the only response to a boozed up, drugged out female crime wave? Are the incarceration stats evidence that women are now just more violent, more dishonest, and more reckless than before? Are we seeing the flip side of gender equality? Are women simply no different to their male counterparts, finding it just as easy to get on the wrong side of the law, or is it something else? With me to discuss these questions and more is the John Moores University academic, Dr Una Barr. Dr Barr is a lecturer in criminology in the United Kingdom, an expert on female desistance, and the author of many research papers on how imprisonment affects women. Dr Barr has worked with the United Kingdom's Howard League for Penal Reform Justice and the Penal Reform Conference, and her latest book, entitled Desisting Sisters, Criminal Justice and Narratives of Resistance, is scheduled to be published later in the year by Palgrave Macmillan. Dr Barr, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you. Hiya.
So, quite a provocative intro there.
Yeah.
Before we get into the meat of the topic, just tell me why you are interested in this area of research.
Yeah, sure. My background, you'll know from my accent, I'm from Ireland, from Northern Ireland. And so obviously I grew up in sort of the aftermath or just coming into the aftermath of the Troubles. And so obviously imprisonment and criminal justice was kind of something which was kind of pervasive in my life and then sort of in the community that I grew up in and that kind of thing. And I've always been interested in gender and kind of how gender operates, particularly, as well, where I grew up is very kind of patriarchal society as well. And particularly I was interested in, for my master's kind of work, I did some work into female Republican prisoners and their experiences of imprisonment during the Troubles, and then after that, the kind of their entry back into society, and particularly back into that kind of patriarchal society, where whether their kind of contributions towards the cause and that kind of thing were recognised or not. So that was where my interest grew in terms of sort of my background, and then from that, I've had a lot of really great kind of lectures and people teaching me in the past about this topic of desistance. And desistance from crime basically means the how and why about the end of offending, so why people stop offending, what are the kind of reasons for that. And I started to think about that in terms of the structures that we find ourselves in, so, the structures of neoliberalism and also of patriarchy. So how those kind of structures affect women's desistance in particular, because if we look at the kind of context of women's sort of offending, you'll see, of course, and I'll talk about this probably a wee bit later, but that how the context of offending are particularly surrounding their victimisation as well, and then the kind of notion of domestic violence in particular being a key issue which surrounds their criminalisation and the beginnings of their offending. So yes, that's why I sort of got into it and done my PhD research on women in England who were criminalised and who served sentences mainly in the community, although quite a few of them had also experienced time in prison. And the kind of what was very clear to me was that these women were criminalised and that their kind of background situations were definitely ones of victimisation, and they were certainly seen as not being maybe the type of people that you would think of as being in prison, not violent offenders, but they had a lot of history of victimisation of violence and that kind of thing. So.
Does your work in Ireland, your interest in how the Troubles had affected women and imprisonment, did that help you in the research that you've done since? Because an outsider may well say, well, it was the politicisation of that conflict in Ireland that may well have brought women into the criminal justice system. An outsider might also say that it might be also the politics or the social politics of the UK which might be driving the incarceration rates. Do you see similarities between the two or not?
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think your second point there is really valid. I think that what I'm interested in is the structures which create this kind of criminalisation. So whether that be the kind of political structures, as happened in Northern Ireland at the time, and the woman that I was sort of interviewing, definitely. But also, I think the structures of the contemporary situation in England and Wales, where we're talking about capitalism, and I think you can't talk about imprisonment without talking about capitalism, without talking about neoliberalism, and particularly, when we're looking at women's imprisonment, talking about gender, and also neocolonialism as well. So, I think that those, I think, doing that work in Northern Ireland kind of got me thinking about the kind of structures which create criminalisation, and which are also present following women's incarceration, or following, the community sentences that they serve. So it's more about what kind of society are we living in, rather than the kind of individualisation of the crimes and their rehabilitation.
Well, right there, you've given a lot of red meat to those people who just want a kind of cause and effect. But allow me to play devil's advocate, Dr. Barr. Clearly, some people will just say, look, more crimes are being committed by women, they're coming before the courts, and they're being imprisoned. That's a cause and effect, action and consequence. So, given that narrative then, how do you explain the fact that more women are going to jail than previously? And it's not just in the UK, it's in the United States and in other countries as well across Europe. How do you explain it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say, just to kind of look wider at that, is it that more people are going to jail, not just more women. So that first of all, we have to kind of address this issue that it is more people. First of all, so what I would, going back to that kind of point that I made there at the start, I would say that is very much related to the kind of structures and the kind of global structures in which we find ourselves, and in particular, as I say, relating that to capitalism and neoliberalism. There's a concept which is called the prison industrial estate, and it's very much kind of coming from the US, but we can see it here more and more within Britain, which is really the tying together of private industry and the criminal justice system, and in particular the prison system. So what we see, in America, you're more likely to have private prisons and that kind of thing, which are kind of being introduced here at the minute. But what we see here, particularly in the UK, is the privatisation of services within prison. For example, we've got companies like Carillion, who provide services to prison, or who did up until a few weeks ago when they were closed down. So we have companies like Carillion, like G4S, and even people like BT providing services within prison. So it's within the kind of certainly within the private company's interest is to keep people in prison. And so then what we see with neoliberalism, we see that that's also within the state's interest as well, when we see the kind of tying together of the state's interest and the kind of private company's interest as well. So I think, we need to understand that as a kind of background factor into why more people are kind of in prison. And in terms of gender and looking at that issue of more women going into prison, I would say again we need to look at the kind of structures in which these women find themselves, and we see sort of rising inequality globally, particularly within Britain in this example. And so in Britain, for example, women are more likely to be affected by austerity. And so we see austerity affecting women's services. So whether that be kind of refuges or women's centres, those kind of cuts to those services. And at the same time, we're seeing, in-work poverty. We're seeing, zero hours contracts and that kind of thing, which are all affecting this kind of poverty, which is particularly experienced by women. So within the UK, we're seeing that most of the kind of rise in the prison population is actually not down to a rise in crime, like you kind of mentioned there before. It's more to do with a rise in the severity of the sentences. So, for example, we have recently had a decrease in the number of women who are sentenced to for example, for theft to shop. So that the kind of the numbers of those who are sentenced has decreased, but at the same time, the severity of the sentences that women receive is increased. So women are more likely to go to prison for that kind of reason. We've also seen a reduction in the number of women who are given community sentences in England and Wales. So the number of community sentences has decreased quite a lot recently. And we also seen as well, when we look at the prison population for women, certainly in England and Wales, you can see that although women only make up about 5% of the prison population, they make up about 10% of the reception into prison. So we see that a lot of women are serving sentences on remand, for which they obviously haven't been being they're innocent until proven guilty. So that women, are increasingly kind of being sentenced sentenced under remand. And also, we've recently seen in England and Wales kind of changes to the criminal justice system and a different kind of approach in the criminal justice system under a new kind of agenda called Transform and Rehabilitation. And under this agenda, women and men are following any kind of period of imprisonment. They're supervised in the community for 12 months. And so this doesn't matter how long the prison sentence is, they'll have a 12-month kind of supervision after that. And so if they breach the conditions of their licence, they will automatically get recalled to prison. So we're seeing kind of rises in imprisonment as a result of that. So, yeah.
All right. Well, there's a lot there. One of the things I would pull from your answer was that you're locating this not necessarily as a gender issue, but more as a societal issue, because more and more people are being caught up. You mentioned the influence of the United States. There is a very famous book that I've read, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which speaks to this very problem about almost the school to prison pipeline. But you also talked about the severity of the sentences. Now, some people will hear what you're saying and say, OK, fine. But how do you account for the fact that, according to the Council of Europe, the incarceration rate for England and Wales for women is 148.3 prisoners per 100,000 people, which is 3 times that of the Netherlands, and of course makes England and Wales the prison capital of Europe for women. Is that because the social pressures which you've spoken to weigh more heavily in the United Kingdom than they do elsewhere, or is it just the severity of sentences? Can you nail down what is happening in the UK that makes it that much harder for women in the UK who are caught up in the criminal justice system than elsewhere in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, my research is kind of based in England and Wales. I'm only able to kind of speak from our point of view, and I think that issue of remand is certainly a big issue, which pushes up the female prison population as compared to the male prison population. And women are also more likely to be in prison for non-violent offences in England and Wales. So about 84% of female sort of offences which have resulted in imprisonment are non-violent offences, and I think that's compared to 70-something% of male offences. So we're seeing a theory. You could bring in a theory here, which is known as Doubledeviance theory, which I think is kind of very prevalent within the UK. Where women are not only judged, for breaking the kind of social contract in terms of breaking laws and things like that, but they're also kind of doubly judged on top of that for breaking what's known as a gender contract, where they're seen as breaking some kind of agreement where women should be meek and mild and not take part in these kind of offences, and so there's an argument there that women are more likely to be more heavily judged in the UK than maybe men would be, and so maybe that might go some way to sort of explaining that difference across across Europe. And we certainly still live in a very patriarchal society where women are sort of socially controlled in sort of varying ways. And, when they break out of this social control by breaking laws and that kind of thing, you can maybe argue that kind of notion of double deviance comes in there.
You've given a very full answer as to why more women are getting caught up in the criminal justice system. But let's say the person who believes prison works, that person may well say, well, should we care that more women are going to prison? If it's not a gender issue, it's more of a social issue, irrespective of whether Britain is a patriarchal society or whether sentences are more severe, or you've talked about neoliberalism and the effect of private prisons and the need to warehouse people just because you get money, I think is the inference from that. Should we as society, as human rights defenders, be concerned that more and more women are going to jail?
Well, yes. But
That's the reason why you're here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I do care about this. I think, again, we can widen this out and say that we should be concerned with the increases in prison sort of more generally. The reason for this is because, time and again, researchers and theorists have shown that prison inflicts pain and causes harm. Is this what we really want our society to be doing? And the argument then, go back to that kind of structural argument, is that prison actually serves to maintain inequality in our society. And if we look sort of at the purposes of prison, which are kind of brought out sort of time and again to explain why we imprison people. There's kind of 4 key reasons why we might do that. And the first is like protection of the public. But if we look at a kind of reoffending rates, and particularly, if we look at female reoffending rates, that 48% of women who leave prison are reconvicted within 1 year. And this rises to 61% of those who serve a sentence of less than 12 months, which women are very likely to be serving. And so that kind of notion of protection of the public can be kind of dismantled there. And then if we look at the other kind of reasons, so in terms of a deterrent, we can look at this statistic that says that 78% of women who have served more than 11 previous custodial sentences will reoffend. So you can see that prison doesn't seem to be a deterrent for those women. And if we look at the kind of notion of rehabilitation, I mean, definitely prison does not rehabilitate. I mentioned earlier that I'm interested in this concept of desistance, which is a theory into the how and why people stop offending. And all the research would point to, maintaining those social bonds to the family, to employment, to kind of conventional social life are so important to desistance. And when we imprison people, and women in particular in this case, we take that away from those people, and they do not in any kind of way serve to rehabilitate those people. And we can look at the reconviction rates to explain that. And then the final kind of reason that we might say that people, that we should use prison is to punish the offender, and this punishment should be proportionate. But if we look, breaking this down into gender, and if we look at the women who serve time in prison, we can see that they are victims, as I mentioned earlier. We've had from the Prison Reform Trust did some research to say that 53% of women in prison have experienced physical or sexual abuse as a child. And this is compared to 27% of men, which again is an extremely high number. And 57% of women report having been victims of domestic violence. And actually, they think that this figure is much kind of reduced because women are obviously, worried about disclosing this information in prison and that kind of thing. And so the charity group Women in Prison suggests that the figure is more like 70%. So when we look at the women who go to prison, who these women are, what their kind of backgrounds and experiences are, you can see that they are victims as well. And is this kind of harm and taking them away from their families, taking them out and into this kind of pointless sort of routine? What what are we trying to do there? Is the harm proportionate? If we say that harm is one of the kind of outcomes that we want to achieve, then is that actually proportionate? We look at these women as sort of victims. And as well, when we look at the figures around mental health and women in prison, it's quite shocking statistics that 65% of women in prison are suffering from depression, and almost a third have entered a psychiatric had a psychiatric admission before entering prison. So when we look at these women as kind of victims as well, and look at the kind of mental health and that kind of thing which surrounds their offending experiences, is prison really the best place for them, or does it actually increase the harm that they've experienced sort of in the past? And I think particularly when we look at women in prison as well, because I mentioned at the start that for example in the UK they're about 5% of the prison population, as a result of that as well, that they're often seen as a kind of policy afterthought, and so their needs and their kind of experiences are not kind of addressed as much as men, and now men's needs are not addressed or taken into account in any kind of way, but certainly for women, that's even more kind of poignant. So, we see that, for example, that women are kept further away from their families when they go to prison because there's only a small amount of women's prison, so they're more likely to be kept those kind of further distances away. And it's something like only 50% of women in prison actually receive visits from their families. So, that kind of impact of imprisonment on women is particularly kind of disproportionate and kind of particularly kind of harmful to their sort of experiences as well. So that might be a reason why we might, be particularly concerned with women in prison. And as well, linking to that kind of mental health issue, we had in 2016, we had the highest rate ever of deaths in prison. 22 women died in prisons in England and Wales. So, that kind of harm is a very kind of serious issue and something which is not sort of being addressed.
Have you done any research to find out what type of crimes women are being sent to prison for, Dr. Barr?
Yeah. I interviewed, as I say, they were women who were, this is part of my PhD research, were women who were serving sentences in the community. And so their offences were, none of the women that I interviewed had served, had violent offences. But again, as I say, that reflects the kind of the kind of general composition of women in prison as well. As I say, most of those haven't committed violent offences either. But when we look at kind of data from the ONS, from the Office of National Statistics, you can see that there is a differentiation between the offences that women are sentenced for as compared to men. So we see that the most common offence which women are brought into the criminal justice system is for TV licence evasion, and other examples of offences where women are more likely to be brought into the criminal justice system for men would be things like cruelty to or neglect of children, truancy, and also benefit fraud. So again, we see those kind of patriarchal structures in terms of women being the carers and that kind of thing, but also the neoliberal structures where we see women kind of increasingly being affected by poverty and inequality. And as I say, women are more likely to be serving sentences for non-violent offences, and they're most likely to be serving offences or to be serving prison sentences for theft offences, and the most common offence of this is for shoplifting. So 80% of theft offences are for shoplifting offences. So you can see there that definitely those structures, both of patriarchy, but also definitely of neoliberalism and the kind of effects that what Pat Carlin calls the feminisation of poverty. where women, are more likely to be doing these unpaid for caring roles, are more likely to be single mothers, are more likely to be in precarious employment, and then at the same time, in the current context, are more likely to be affected by austerity measures, and particularly women's services are more likely to be affected by austerity measures.
So you wrote a paper, I've got the title here, Are Neoliberal Patriarchal Societies Compatible with Desistance? This is research that was published last year. You're convinced that the impact of neoliberalism and patriarchal societies is severe when it comes to women incarceration. You're convinced of that?
Yeah, I am. And I think, when we look at the background to sort of criminalization of women, you can see that it is very much on the in the largest kind of sense. It's very much linked to their experiences of poverty, of gendered inequality, of domestic violence, and that kind of thing. And I think, especially if we're looking at desistance, I think one of the things that the desistance literature and desistance theory is kind of neglected is these structures in which women desist, when they leave prison or when they finish their community sentences. Those kind of conditions are often still in place and are often made worse. So, for example, that women are more likely to leave prison homeless and more likely to leave prison without a job to go to than men. So those kind of structures are kind of made even worse by their experiences of the criminal justice system.
You've talked about the feminisation of poverty. I'm just wondering if your research has shown any link between imprisonment, women, and class and ethnicity, as it does all the time when it comes to men.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's the same case with women, and we've talked about those kind of structures, particularly of patriarchy and referring to neoliberalism, but also that there's definitely an issue with colonialism and neocolonialism within the criminal justice system. So again, Pat Carlin, who I keep referencing, she talks about three main features of women's law breaking, and she says that women's crimes are in the main crimes of the powerless. The women in prison are disproportionately from ethnic minority groups, and that a majority of women in prison have been in poverty for the greater part of their life. So that intersectional understanding is really kind of important when we look at sort of women's experiences of the criminal justice system. So I talked a wee bit about the feminisation of poverty and a wee bit about that, but in terms of looking more deeply at ethnicity and kind of the criminal justice system being a racist institution, we can see that again, a report published last year by the Prison Reform Trust showed that black and mixed ethnicity women are more than twice as likely as white women to be arrested. And they're more likely than other women to be remanded and sentenced to custody. And last year we saw that about 11% of women in prison were foreign nationals. We know from their kind of experiences and them talking about their experiences that a lot of them have been coerced or trafficked into offending. So you could definitely see that the kind of disproportionate effect on those kind of different groups, and within the criminal justice system as well, black and minority ethnic women are more likely to suffer harm from the system. So they're more likely to experience racism both from fellow prisoners and from staff within these institutions, and they're more likely to report feeling less safe. So they're unlikely to report feeling safe within these kind of institutions as well.
What is the evidence that shows that women are going to jail for offences that don't result in custodial sentences for male offenders? Because that's counterintuitive. There is a stereotype that if a woman appears in court heavily pregnant or claiming to have children at the home, that the judge or the magistrate may well treat her more leniently. It seems to be now that might not be the case. What do you have to say on that? Yeah,
and I think the kind of theory that you're talking about there is this kind of notion of chivalry within the criminal justice system, and when women go to court, they're this, especially if they have those kind of caring responsibilities, or are shown to have those caring responsibilities, then they're less likely to receive prison. And I do wish that was the case, but all the evidence says that's not the case, and that actually women are more likely to be sentenced to prison for a first offence than men. As I say, there's the proportion of women serving sentences for non-violent offences is higher than men. So as I say, women are disproportionately experiencing imprisonment, without actually having been given a prison sentence. So that there are differences there between the way that women and men are kind of treated within the criminal justice system and within the court system, definitely.
So, Dr Barr, for researchers such as yourself and others, how seminal was the Causton report that was published by the UK government in 2007?
Yeah, the Causton report was, so it was in response to, in 2006, the deaths of 6 women in Style Prison in Lancashire. And as a result, Baroness Causton was charged with looking into the experiences of women in prison in particular. And what she said was she was looking into the experiences of vulnerable women. And my argument would be that most women, or all women in prison, are kind of vulnerable women. So there was a report that was published, as you say, in 2007, and within that report, Baroness Causton made 42 recommendations, and generally at the time it was met with quite a lot of encouragement, and it was well received, kind of had cross-party support at the time, and it looked like that things might start to change. And so her kind of overarching finding was that women's needs are best addressed outside of prison in the main. So we fast forward sort of a decade later. So last year there was a lot of kind of research into how this has kind of held up a decade later, and they found that obviously the reason why we're talking today is because of we've had this kind of increase in women in prison. So obviously the Causton's recommendations were not kind of implemented, and they weren't kind of addressed in any kind of meaningful way, and in fact have actually been reversed in many of the ways that we've just been talking about. So the Causton report, it was very kind of well-meaning, in my opinion, and was obviously Causton really wanted to address those issues about women in prison, and particularly women with specific vulnerabilities. However, I think that what the kind of failure there, what Causton sort of failed to do, was to address those kind of structural issues which surround women's criminalisation, and address those kind of issues that I've been talking about around poverty, around patriarchy, and around kind of abuse, domestic violence that often result in women being criminalised. So she took a quite of an individualistic kind of approach, and saying that that women need to be supported sort of on a case-by-case basis and that kind of thing. So I think that was one of the kind of key things which the Causton report missed. But despite that, it did have that kind of support at the start, but obviously ever since, and again, I would link that to kind of the structures of neoliberalism in particular, but also, patriarchy, neocolonialism, that these recommendations were not implemented at all.
I know you've written a lot about this in your own research, Dr. Barr, but I just wondered if we could look at this from a gender perspective. For example, do you note any difference in the way in which children are affected by the imprisonment of their mothers as opposed to the imprisonment of their fathers?
Yeah, definitely. And that's one of the kind of key findings, from Causton and that kind of thing, that children are much more likely to be affected by their mother's imprisonment rather than their father's imprisonment. So in 2010, I think it's the year that we have most recent statistics for, there was around 17,200 children separated from their mothers as a result of imprisonment, and it's only I think it's 9% of these cases that the children were able to stay with their father during this time. So a lot of the vast majority of mothers who are entering prison are single mothers, are caring for the children by themselves, and so this has a drastic effect on the children's experiences, and so has a huge kind of societal and wider sort of effect. So, we saw that some studies from a few years ago showed that a small percentage of women didn't know what was happening to their children when they went into prison. That there was a certain number of children who the mothers weren't even sure about what was happening to them when they actually went into prison. And we can see, from various studies into the effects that this will have on the children. The impact, as I say, can be harmful for the women, for the men in prison, but also for the kind of wider society. And we can see that, the children whose parents have gone into prison, and particularly children whose mothers have gone into prison, have been more at risk of poverty, of poor health, of insecure housing and finances, and poor mental health as well. So you can see that those kind of harmful effects are very kind of wide-reaching, and in fact not only just the kind of individual entering prison, but also the kind of their families and wider society. And as I mentioned there earlier, women, because of their small proportion of the prison population, they're more likely to be further away from home and are less likely to receive those kind of visits. So that kind of notion of social bonds is very much kind of just completely broken and disintegrated, even more so for women than men.
But just as a point of interest, what should happen to transgender women who are subject to prison terms, in your view?
I think it's a very good question, and I think it's a question which is just sort of in the media and stuff at the minute, in particular. What I would say is that a lot of the right-wing media that is, suddenly very shocked about transgender women perhaps entering women's prisons, has not been concerned with women in prison up until this point, and not concerned with the harm that prison causes to women up until this point. So I think there's a kind of an argument there that needs to be sort of dismantled. I would say that we've had experienced in England and Wales recently a lot of deaths of transgender women who are serving sentences in male prisons, and so this is something which is really key to need to be kind of addressed in the short term. And I would recommend maybe to your listeners to a podcast that deals with this very issue and deals with it really well, which is called The Lockdown, by Novara Media, and they had an episode where they spoke to Chrissy Hunter, who's a transgender activist who works with a program called Bent Bars to support LGBT prisoners. And my opinion is that, of course, in the short term, that transgender women should be held in women's prisons if that's where they want to be held. But obviously in the long term, my concern would be about prison abolition, and the harmful effects that prison creates are even more felt by for example, transgender women and transgender men as well. So that kind of intersectional harm which prison causes is very, very important to kind of consider.
The recidivism rate, I think it compares quite favourably to male recidivism rates based on the research that I've seen. But are the barriers that female ex-offenders face on their re-entry into society the same as or different to the barriers that men might face, Dr. Barr?
Sure. Just on that first point, I think that a lot of, this kind of notion that women don't reoffend at the same rate as men. I think that a lot of that has to do with this kind of concept of social control, and again linking that to patriarchy. When we see that it is kind of seen as even more bad. That's not very well grammatically phrased, but that it is bad that women when they commit an offence, acquire an offence, they suffer a lot of stigma for that kind of thing. So, that kind of notion that women reoffended at a lesser rate, we have to link that to this kind of concept of social control and social control of women within patriarchal societies. But in terms of women's re-entry, there are differences between their kind of re-entry experiences and male re-entry. And what I kind of mentioned earlier was that women are less likely to exit prison into a sort of stable housing situation, and are less likely to leave prison and have a good sort of employment prospect as well when they leave prison. So I've heard kind of anecdotal sort of stories about probation workers and that kind of thing, going around and giving women sleeping bags when they leave prison, because the women have nowhere to go and have a sort of no place to go. So there's that kind of issue around, definitely around homes and secure housing, and around employment as well, because of course, despite what desistance research would show, that employment and especially meaningful employment is really important to desistance experiences. Obviously, imprisonment and criminal records kind of make that less likely that prisoners, kind of all genders, are likely to have a good sort of employment prospect. But as well, which is important with that in terms of prison, breaking those social bonds, and particularly for women, as I said, that less than half of women in prison are likely to receive visits from their families. So those kind of bonds with families can often be really fractured because of imprisonment. And obviously when we look into desistance and the importance of family and the importance of relationships, that is definitely kind of fractured by the prison situation. And as well, I mentioned at the start that kind of real kind of prevalence of victimization as a result of domestic abuse, which provides a context of women's offending, doesn't often go away when women are released back into the community. And so those kind of relationships, those kind of abusive relationships are often still there. And so obviously that kind of can have a particular effect on women's experiences sort of post imprisonment. So those kind of social bonds, which desistance theorists talk about quite a lot, are very much fractured by the criminalization which women kind of face, and also in terms of kind of cognitive, the cognitive theory around desistance is that people who are desistent should gain this kind of new identity where they don't see themselves as an offender anymore. And as I mentioned, that kind of a theory about double deviance, often this is doubly hard for women. And I definitely saw that with my kind of research in Northern Ireland, where women, are kind of doubly faced with this stigma and expected just to go back into this kind of, I'm talking about Northern Ireland here, but expected to go back into this, kind of mothering role or homemaker role, despite the kind of things which they got involved in the past. And you can see that obviously as well with kind of the kind of traditional kind of offences and criminalisation, which we see here in England and Wales, and that kind of notion of stigma surrounding women's offending is something which women often have to work doubly hard to kind of overcome. So in terms of the cognitive issues surrounding desistance, they're often quite different for women.
Tell us, what are the optimum conditions then for desistance? You've talked already about the need for meaningful employment. What other factors need to be in place to encourage desistance?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the desistance literature has really been taken from the white male perspective, and so we can only say so much about that and how that kind of impacts on women's experiences or experiences of Black minority ethnic groups, particularly, as I say, within these structures of patriarchy, of neocolonialism, of racism. So, there are kind of three kind of theories around desistance. One, and the one that was kind of taken for granted for a long period of time within criminology, traditional criminology in particular, was that people just kind of mature out of crime and sort of eventually just stop offending.
That's definitely in the research for young males, for example.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
They fall in love and maybe get a job and then they stop committing crimes.
That's it, yeah, that's exactly it. And the Shad Morona talks about it as this kind of stable job and the love of a good woman. Now, the woman that I talked to in my research, often a lot of those women were partners of men who were, coming out of prison or attempting to kind of desist from crime. And these women had their own stories as well. They had their own experiences. They weren't just this kind of good woman who stayed in the house and looked after the men and made sure that the men didn't go out committing any crime. That they had their own kind of experiences of victimization and abuse, but also of criminalization and their own kind of harms that they've experienced as well, which often isn't taken into account in the desistance literature. So, I think that kind of theory around social bonds can also be harmful to women who maybe are not the protagonists in that story, but who also obviously have their own kind of issues going on as well. So there's that kind of notion of maturation and getting older, and it just happens naturally. There's the issue of social bonds and that kind of thing, employment and family. And then there's a cognitive theory, as I say, which is very much kind of linked to identity, linked to hope, agency, and obviously agency as well. When we talk about agency, and women's experiences of agency are very much different to men's experiences, particularly as I keep going back to, and this is the thing which I would argue that desistance theory doesn't address, is that this kind of notion of the structures in which criminalization kind of takes place, and particularly, as I say, with patriarchy.
Does that mean then that we're not ready to deal with this sudden boom in the prison population amongst women? That we don't know what the factors are that we need to put in place, or the conditions that we need to put in place to make sure that desistance rates amongst women increase?
Well, my own perspective on that would be that, well, what doesn't help is criminalization, is continuing sort of criminalization of women who are victims, who have severe mental health issues and that kind of thing. So that kind of issue of criminalization needs to be sort of taken away in the vast majority of cases. But if we are to support desistance, we need to look at those structures. And so it's addressing domestic violence, it's addressing mental health, providing support, and not cutting services, and providing safe spaces for women to go, and not, as I say, cutting refuges and that kind of thing. So making sure that the society that we live in is less patriarchal, is less neoliberal, is less neocolonial, and is more more concerned with social justice. Rather than this kind of notion of criminal justice. That would be my argument, that we need to address those structures in whatever way we can.
So if we were to look at this finally, Dr. Barr, from a gender perspective, I think it builds on your last answer, but I think it's an important question to close our conversation. What would societies and lawmakers need to change to reduce the numbers specifically of women going to prison? Is it just these big ticket themes, less neocolonialism, less racism, discrimination, less patriarchy, and less neoliberalism? Or are there other things that we could do?
Well, I think, in the long term, that with those structures still in place, we're still going to, the numbers of women in prison and are likely to go up or stay the same. So, in the long term, I would completely argue that dismantling of those structures is what is needed. In the short term, we can look at sentencing tariffs, and we can look at the way in which women are sort of dealt with in the criminal justice system, and seeing, kind of going along with what Causton would have argued there, that whether women's needs can be best addressed in the community, which in the the vast majority, Causton would argue, certainly can. Those kind of non-violent offences and that kind of thing, can we look at those and seeing, are these best addressed in the community, best addressed through women's centres and that kind of thing. So, I think decriminalisation is kind of the way forward on this, but obviously, challenging those structures and that kind of thing. But in the short term, looking at that sentencing and looking at how we sentence women, sentence mothers, and that kind of thing.
On that note, Dr. Barr, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much for having me.